I am Hermes, messenger of the gods. We are all familiar with the ego, but many of us have misunderstood what the ego truly is. The ego is the center of consciousness, a function that allows you to distinguish yourself from others. Many spiritual teachers stamp the ego as a detrimental part of ourselves, claiming we must distance ourselves from it. But it's truly not possible to dissolve your ego, for it's the structure that orders your unique qualities in a way that differentiates yourself from others. It's the sense of personal identity. There is another part of ourselves called the unconscious, which remains in the background, but it is in no way inactive. The unconscious compromises everything within that remains hidden, unexpressed, and therefore repressed. This unconscious inevitably expresses itself in everything we do, think, say, and feel, although we are mostly unaware of its effects. The unconscious cannot be contained. It is constantly trying to bring us into balance, into a state of completeness. And this oftentimes comes out in the form of disharmonious thoughts, actions, and attitudes towards oneself and the world. Individuation is the process by which one becomes the true self, an infinite expression of uniqueness and self-sufficiency at a microcosmic level. It is the goal of what spiritual schools call enlightenment, and individuation is a process which aids the collective into widespread realization, for each man who finds this true self adds a piece to the ascensional puzzle on earth. The self is often seen as something we automatically know, but in the context of individuation, the self is very hidden. It is the ego which we know. The self is what we are in essence, the perfect unified being. To be the self is the goal of this entire experience. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood, ultimate self-realization, the quest for totality. Many religions and esoteric schools have long held the belief that growth is about breaking down the self in order to serve others. But this is the opposite of the truth. It's only when we become centered within our own vessel that we can most effectively be a source of inspiration and guidance for the world. Let's look at the persona. The persona is the image we aim to project onto others of ourselves, the mask that pretends individuality. Although a persona may seem real to oneself and others, it is nothing more than a well-played role. The persona is a compromise one creates between himself and others regarding how one appears to be. This could be a set of personality traits which correspond to a title, an occupation, or a specific image one has convinced themselves as being favorable. In the persona, one can believe they're a doctor, a sales clerk, a musician, a misfit, an intellectual, but these are simply masks, ways we would like to be or appear to other people. The persona reveals what we value for ourselves, but also hides our true nature, and is mostly used to accommodate what we feel others wish for ourselves. Identifying the persona is crucial in the process of individuation. One must take a good look in the mirror and ask themselves, what persona do I aim to project? What masks do I wear? Identify this persona and realize that it is a farce and has little to do with the underlying aspects of your true self. Religious and spiritual dogma can oftentimes make us feel that we can just create the persona of a self-realized person. This is a prime barrier in this process. We must discard every persona we've conjured up in the past. No matter who you are or your background, there is a persona that can be shed. Let's look at the shadow. The shadow is a part of the unconscious mind consisting of repressed weaknesses, shortcomings, emotions, attitudes, and even instincts. Most of us have been raised to suppress instead of express. We are told as children to act a specific way, to avoid certain behaviors and thoughts, and this creates a mechanism of suppression within the psyche. The inner shadow retreats to an unconscious state, primitive and undifferentiated. Then, when the shadow breaks through this repressive barrier, and this does happen once in a while, it manifests itself in a sinister, pathological way, and is often further repressed because of how uncomfortable it feels. This repression, as we discussed in the Individuation introduction video, can create a loop of suffering if unaddressed. And this suffering is a huge contributor in the energy extraction matrix system, which is nothing more than what happens when our shadows remain hidden and therefore used against us by our so-called leaders and governments, who consistently funnel fear-based programming, which further grows the personal and collective shadow of humanity. When one tries to see his shadow, he becomes conscious and often ashamed of the characteristics and impulses that he denies in himself, but sees clearly in other people. It could be greed, laziness, egotism, unreal fantasies, indifference, anger, all those parts of ourselves we readily accept in the world, but not within us. Phrases like, "the world is a scary place," and "humans are naturally evil," are rooted in the concept that the disharmony is orchestrated externally and not internally. But it's a rule that if an aspect of ourselves is not expressed and incorporated within, it will be expressed without. Essentially, we project outwards what we haven't inwardly resolved. The shadow is all those uncivilized desires and emotions that are incompatible with the norms of society and with our ideal personality. It is all that we are ashamed of, that we do not wish to be. But this judgment of the shadow being undesirable, again, leads to inevitably expressing the shadow. The unconscious leaks into the conscious, and before we know it, we are experiencing the disharmony we so aimed to ignore. The shadow snowballs, gets bigger and bigger as we further repress ourselves in the name of maintaining our persona. So a crucial step in individuation is the confrontation and thus assimilation of the shadow. Again, the shadow represents the aspects which are rejected by the ego, but which are projected in other people as belonging to them. It's the darkness which we have separated from our wholeness. Looking at oneself and admitting to jealous, greedy, selfish, narcissistic tendencies, this is making the darkness conscious. It's realizing one's moral deficiencies without the filter of the persona. And through this practice, one finds that the darkness all along was just a coping mechanism, a seed of trauma planted early on in one's development. This makes the darkness actually appear cute and in desperate need of unconditional love, not repression. Let's look at the Anima and Animus. Just as males and females are outwardly different yet complementary, there are dormant inverse energies within. Anima, in the unconscious of the male, is the inner feminine personality. Animus, in the unconscious of the female, is the inner masculine personality. So the Anima and Animus are the opposite gendered parts of ourselves, which can be realized and fully developed to erect the true self. To put in another way, there is in the unconscious of each man an inherent image of woman who helps him understand her being, and in the unconscious of each woman an inherent image of man who helps her to understand his being. When the anima is not fully integrated, the man can express without conscious control greed, moodiness, egotism, and the inability to relate to others. But when the anima in a man is fully integrated, he can access the parts of himself which are self-nurturing, creative, empathetic, intuitive, and longing to relate to others harmoniously. When the animus in a woman is not fully integrated, a woman can express unconsciously a domineering, boastful, and emotionally uncontrollable personality. But when the animus in a woman is fully integrated, she can access the parts of herself which are rational, centered, strong, and full of divine courage. In the context of resolving dualism, the incorporation and development of our inner opposite is absolutely necessary. A man projects his anima onto typically one woman at a time, usually his partner or lover. These projections that I'm going to talk about, they're archetypes which are representative of the inner opposite and the state of that. An undeveloped anima is like Marilyn Monroe, a physically and sexually attractive female who embodies external beauty and enchantment. A much more developed anima would be Mary Poppins, a strong, independent woman who is equally kind, loving, and in touch with her femininity. The ultimate developed anima would be the Virgin Mary, the embodiment of the complete divine feminine, transcending the limitations of this world. A woman projects her animus on men in her life, but unlike the typically singular projection of the anima, this projection happens to many, if not all men, in a woman's life. An undeveloped animus is like Tarzan, a brute man who exhibits physical but not mental or spiritual endurance. A much more developed animus would be James Bond, a smart, courageous, and capable man who has both physical and mental appeal. The ultimate developed animus would be like Jesus Christ, the embodiment of the true sacred masculine, who is full in his power in all ways. So whatever state of anima and animus one projects outwardly is representing that state within. So to realize the state of your anima or animus, ask yourself a question. What do you find when you think of a desirable woman or man? Is it sexual attraction, a strong leader, someone who is nurturing, a tyrant? What is the image that is conjured? This image will tell you the state of your inner dormant inverse energies, and by default will reveal what must be developed or emphasized in order to further that image into something more transcendent. The next step in the process of individuation is the encounter with the archetypes of the wise old man and the great mother. These images embrace our unfiltered, divine wisdom, the meaning and significance of life. The wise man and great mother are archetypes symbolizing a universal and timeless wisdom. The encounter with these archetypes is what spiritual schools have called interacting with the higher self, being able to find wisdom within everything, not because we were told there is wisdom there, but because our intuition guides us and tells us so. At this step, the self is finally able to be uncovered and experienced, but this isn't a universal consciousness or hive mind that you're tapping into. Like we said at the beginning, individuation is the process of realizing full awareness of our unique nature and our intimate connection with ourselves and thus our surroundings. In summary, the individuation process is as follows: identification and thus stripping of the persona and its inherent falsehoods, the extraction and thus transmutation of the shadow, the parts of ourselves which have remained repressed and thus projected onto external reality, the reconciliation with our inner masculine and feminine aspects and how they are projected onto others, the encounter with the archetypal wise old man and great mother, the divine teacher within that is accessed through bringing the unconscious into the conscious. This is generally not a process which can be completed in a specific time frame. The unconscious cannot be completely assimilated. It is practically infinite in its manifestations. This is why this process is always going on within one who is aiming to achieve true self-realization. Our intentions guide our path and pave the way for expansion. So one must first have the inner fire that says, I want to become whole and truly know thyself. Careful observation of one's thought forms and actions and how they correspond and manifest lead us into realizing our unconscious and thus the perils of swinging from one extreme to another. We must heal. After all, if we cannot heal ourselves, we cannot effectively create the change that many of us feel is so desperately needed in the world. I am Hermes, messenger of the gods, eternally at your service.